Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the RTS podcast. I don't actually have a name for this yet. I'm still going with RTS podcast. I suppose we have a monopoly
Are
on
you trying
RTS
to tell me this
podcasts.
isn't fully scripted?
Wait. What about Command and Conquer Combat Comcast? Something like that.
Wow, that was
Rolls
nice.
right off the tongue.
Rolls right off the tongue.
No, that wasn't pre-planned.
Alliterations, man.
The problem with that though is it's not specifically C&C. When I say like the podcast, I mean I've done probably about 5 of these, and for the most part we've been talking about Company of Heroes. Last time we talked about Dawn of War 3 with a bunch of Company of Heroes 2 guys, and someone in the comments left like the co-optional podcast with like COH. So that was quite a funny pun.
It's funny.
Yeah.
I was scrolling through your comments and I saw that exact comment. I was like, that is brilliant right there.
Yeah.
That's exactly what you need.
Yeah.
I love bad puns. This guy, yeah.
But
Kudos.
today we're going to be
Nailed
talking about Command and Conquer as opposed to Company of Heroes or whatever RTS we normally talk about. So today I have 3 guys that are sort of in the C&C community, a bit less monolithic bacon. Sparty is a caster for C&C 3, 5 Aces is a caster for OpenRA, and Monolithic Bacon is a cool dude. Is that okay?
Yeah, that'll do. Thanks. Yeah.
Hey, wait. Can we try this again? I'd like to get a new name.
Okay, well, what do you want to refer to yourself as?
I'm just playing.
You're just playing. Okay, cool. So the first thing that we're going to be talking about, I suppose, is why our favorite C&C games are our favorite C&C games. Because I wanted to kind of compare the differences between them, because the 3 of us here, apart from Mono, again, he's kind of the black sheep in this podcast, because we are shoutcasters that focus most of our effort on a particular C&C game. I kind of want to work out why that is. So if you want to start, Sparty, why is C&C 3 your favorite Command and Conquer game, or RTS specifically, and why do you enjoy casting it and playing it compared to other C&C games?
Boy, that's a tough one. I don't know that I've given a quick answer to that before, but I guess I don't know that I would say that it's my favorite C&C. It's definitely the one that I feel I can bring some value to in terms of casting. I mean, like I love watching like Red Alert 2, Red Alert 3, when Cybert was doing casts over there for that. You know, and there's still some other casters over there doing that. You know, watching you guys do 0 Hour, it's great. It's just I think probably, I imagine it's true with all of us, is that, you know, you have a particular game in a particular series in the Command and Conquer universe because it's just so large. You've got you've got Red Alert, you've got Command and Conquer, and you've got 0 Hour that are 3 almost entirely separate universes. You know, there's some similar mechanics between them, particularly more so between Red Alert and Command and Conquer, in my opinion. But yeah, I don't know. I think I grew up playing Red Alert as a kid, long ago, ages ago, and always loved the series. I always loved the lore, the story behind the Command and Conquer universe was always just so interesting to me. So it's always been one of those things that's kind of been in the back of my mind for forever. And then a few years ago, I just started watching. I started playing Command and Conquer 3. I think I was actually playing Kane's Wrath with a friend of mine on Xbox 360 of all places, and we were just having so much fun playing that game. And you know, as a result, we'd go on YouTube and try to look up videos and things like that. And he turned me on to a number of different casters, yourself, Green Zero, Cybert, all those guys, C&C Zone people from back in the day. And we'd sit there and watch through videos and learn the game, and then we'd see that it's like, wow, the way that we were playing the game was so different from the way that everybody else was playing the game. But I mean, we still had fun with it, and that was what got me interested in the game, because I enjoyed the game just in its own right on my own. And then when I found the competitive community, it exploded, because it seemed like the skill ceiling was just so high in the game in comparison to what I thought it was before. And I just fell in love with it. And I mean, I could talk forever about why I specifically love Command and Conquer 3.
That's what we're here for.
Ib Wars and Kane's Wrath over Zero Hour or Red Alert, but I don't know. I think it's just the way that the meta plays out. I mean, I don't want to take up all the time in terms of explaining where I came from, but that's really the nuts and bolts of why I love it. It's just one of those games that I can't put a tangible feeling to it, but it's just so good. It's just so
Yeah.
good.
It's funny when you made the comment about like how you were playing the game the wrong way. That happens in every RTS game. You look at like the kind of the competitive multiplayer scene, and there's a huge divide between people that get it and people that don't. I think Zero Hour is probably more extreme than the other CNC games, but like you have so many noobs that just bunker up, turtle up, sit in their base, try and build defenses and shit. And then you get people that get it, even if they're not the best players. They rush, they expand, they just have better RTS fundamentals, and they just crush them every time. And there's like this huge skill flaw where you have skill gap where you have like the competitive people, and then you have the noobs, and then in the middle there's just this empty space where there's this massive gap.
Well, nowadays, absolutely, because the game's so old. So the players that are at the top have only continued to get better to the point where they're not going to really improve that much more beyond where they're at, because there's really not much more to improve upon. The meta's already formed. They've figured out the best counters for certain rushes and certain build orders, and you can only improve your muscle memory at that point, and repetition is just that's what's going to win you games.
Yeah, it's not StarCraft. It doesn't have that same level of APM depth to it. Yeah, that's
Well,
kind of.
Yeah.
I was going to say, in one thing, it's kind of sad about CNC in as a series in general, is that it just doesn't quite have the same skill ceiling as StarCraft.
So do you feel that the skill ceiling is due to the fact that there's higher APM in that game?
Well, in StarCraft, I mean, there's a lot of reasons. I mean, there's the APM side of it. Like, having an APM higher than 150 in CNC3 isn't going to make any difference, and I think you could make that argument for any CNC game. But even just the strategy in general, like StarCraft, I don't want to sound like, I love StarCraft more than I love CNC, but you can't deny that StarCraft has a lot more strategy and depth to it in terms of viable unit compositions, how much goes into the thought process of all the matchups. You have to think a lot more about, like, what units you're building and why, whereas... CNC3 probably less so, but like in Red Alert 3 and Zero Hour, like it's pretty like, okay, let's build some Humvees. Yep. Let's build some Tengus. Yep.
Yeah. Well, and I guess the way that I've always kind of viewed StarCraft in terms of why it's far more competitive than Command and Conquer is like, yeah, sure. I kind of view APM as almost like an artificial skill ceiling, is that you're not really adding strategy, you're just adding button presses, and again, with repetition and muscle memory, you'll get to that level. Granted, some people will just have a natural gift for it, but when that starts becoming more important than the actual strategy, that's when I think that you start getting away from a skill, like a higher skill ceiling, and become more of an artificial skill ceiling, in that you're forced to learn this specific muscle memory in order to compete.
Yeah, but the APM doesn't come at the expense of strategy. Like people often conflate that high APM means that it's less about strategy. I think it's kind of equal. Like StarCraft is like it's part strategy, part APM, and the APM is like a resource which you need to allocate efficiently towards certain tasks, like dropping your opponent. Certain unit compositions are more APM heavy than others. So there is a big part of StarCraft that you can play without APM, but like up to a certain level you need APM. But APM isn't the only thing, right? Like it's one part of it.
Right.
You need to know builds, you need to have decision making. There's a lot more to it than that. But anyway, let's finish asking the rest of these guys. What about you, Five Aces? I'll ask you the same question. Why is OpenRA your favorite CNC game, or if not, why is it the game that you do content for specifically?
So first off, I'd like to jump into the train of thought that was previously started about StarCraft versus CNC. So I've played both games, but not like religiously. I've not played StarCraft competitively, but I actually think most of the actions in StarCraft come from come from macro decisions. Like I think the macro is just what plays a much bigger role in StarCraft, because you don't have infinite build queues, you don't have you have multiple barracks, and you can like pump out units from multiple barracks. It just takes more APM to allocate all your resources to get your build order straight. And Command & Conquer is just a bit more flexible in that regard. But yeah, why do I love OpenRA? It's basically I got hooked on the classic Red Alert. I was like 7 or 8 years, can't remember, and it had just such a dense atmosphere. Like this, the cutscenes played actually a big role. The cutscenes were amazing for their time, and I still think they still hold up. They're still amazing. A great mood, great atmosphere, and that was what sucked me into this world back then. And now we have OpenRA, which is like, if you think back to the actual gameplay of Red Alert, it was just tank spam. Yeah. There was no other strategy than tank spam, because tanks were everything. And if you built like an engineer, yeah, you wasted cash, you wasted $500. But OpenRA has kind of modernized this concept and introduced lots of things that lacked in the original. Like, well, they just weren't there at the time. Like concepts like fog of war, or capturable objectives like oil derricks or hospitals, stuff like that. All that got added in OpenRA, and now it's like the complete package for me. It's nostalgia plus a competitive game that is actually enjoyable to play and actually has a really, really amazingly big competitive scene for what it does right now. I also enjoy building up the competitive scene.
There's actually like a counter system. Like you build rocket infantry and they kill tanks. Where in the original C&C games, like tanks would just crush infantry. I even remember like C&C 3 at launch was just as bad. Like infantry were just worthless. It was all about tank spam. And I mean, it still kind of is. Like C&C 3 is weird in the way that, like I find infantry in small numbers doesn't really work that well, but infantry in big numbers works very well. So it's kind of like you either man spam or you just don't put infantry. Like there isn't a lot of middle ground. Would you agree?
Yeah, like in infantry don't scale linearly. I believe it's the more
that's a good way of wording it. Yeah,
the more deadly.
Once you get critical mass, where there's just too many to crush with tanks.
They're
I mean, it definitely in C&C 3 specifically, there's definitely an advantage to having a larger mass of infantry, like you were saying. Obviously, they don't scale as great on their own. However, I mean, again, ignoring the special infantry in that game and just looking at like the standard riflemen, rocket squads, blah blah blah. Rocket squads, when they're mixed in with like a larger artillery composition or units that normally would be a bit squishier and open to light attack harass, like attack bikes and things like that, or pit bulls. Things like that, then they can become an extremely useful part of the composition, because otherwise your artillery wouldn't be able to move out beyond your base defenses, because they're just going to get picked off by the fast attack vehicles. So there is some value, but I see what you're saying. Yes, man spam is definitely a strategy, and it's been a prolific strategy by one of the most overpowered factions in the game.
What faction would that be? I have no idea.
Certainly not Black Hand. Not at all. Not at all.
All right, Will, you haven't said anything so far, so it's your turn now. What's your favorite C&C game and why?
I'd say by far my favorite would be 0 Hour.
Nice. That was the correct answer.
I grew up... yeah, I thought you might. I grew up with 0 Hour. I think one of the first ones I ever played was Red Alert, and at the time it was probably something my computer wasn't able to play very well, even though it's pretty minimal by today's standards. But 0 Hour just hooked me, and I suppose it almost adversely to you guys in that I've never played these competitively. I've never had the stomach for it. I've never really enjoyed it as much, sweating through all my clothes when playing a 1v1 game. But 0 Hour brought something to RTSs in terms of music and visuals that I'd never really seen before. The music in particular for C&C games is immense, absolutely immense. And 0 Hour nailed it, and it's still a soundtrack and OST that I absolutely adore. I think it's done something that I've not really seen since. But yeah, 0 Hour by a long shot, especially because of its diversity in commanders and how it changed what Generals was when it was first released. It took the same idea and just ran with it, and it worked.
Yeah, I've talked a lot about why I like Zero Hour from the perspective of like a pretty competitive mindset, but I think there's a lot of reasons why Zero Hour in particular is very good from like a casual perspective, like the way that the secondary economy works, the way that super weapons work, the way that like the base defenses are very quirky and very fun to use compared to most games where base defenses are pretty generic. Another reason why I think CNC3 is good, like the Obelisk of Light, the Wave Force Tower. The screen one's not that interesting, but like CNC as a franchise in general generally has very fun and quirky unit design, where that's a lot of the criticisms that I make towards these newer RTS games that have tried to kind of replicate the CNC formula, such as Grey Goose, such as Active Aggression, is that they can sometimes have sort of similar gameplay. 8-Bit Armies is probably the most egregious example, but the units are just so generic and so bland. Like in 8-Bit Armies, it was so much like the original CNC game, like, you know, where it was kind of all tank spam, but like everything was just a archetype. It was like rifle infantry, rocket infantry, tank, machine gun turret, helicopter. Like that was it. Like you don't have any quirky cool stuff like the Scorpion tanks that have this like actual tail thing on them. And so if you couldn't enjoy it from the gameplay perspective, but you couldn't also enjoy it from just a kind of experience perspective, like just the aesthetics of it. Whereas the older CNC game, and I basically made this argument in my review for 8-Bit Armies, is that while the gameplay doesn't hold up to modern day standards, it's still, you can go back and play it because of how iconic the sound effects and the units and the music are.
Yeah, it has personality.
Yeah. You can tell that there's like, you know, some kind of artistic vision that's gone into it, not just like this cash grab that's like, all right, let's churn out this shitty CNC clone, and because we are ex-Westwood staff, Petroglyph, we can get away with incredibly mediocre games, and people will still buy it because of the banner of ex-Westwood, which is just so overused.
I couldn't agree anymore. Like, Command & Conquer has such iconic units. When you think about it, like even just not on a functional level, but on a design level, they are amazing. Like, look at the Orcas. It's one of the coolest aircrafts that's ever been devised. Or look at just an angry mob coming at you. No other game had this. Like, just an angry mob of people throwing Molotov cocktails around. Yeah. And you can arm them with AK-47s. It's awesome.
It's so funny what Zero Hour got away with. Whereas like a game by today's standards. Well, I mean, back then
this point would come up.
It came out in like 2003, right? And that was kind of post 9/11, which was where, you know, people were a lot more critical towards kind of like Middle Eastern terrorism. When now it's very taboo to talk about like terrorism and talk about Islam and stuff. So like a game like Zero Hour today, it just wouldn't get away with it. But the funny thing about Zero Hour, like, it's not just goofy in its portrayal of GLA, it's also like incredibly goofy and patronizing towards America. Like how all the units are like, let's blow something up. And like the Paladin is like really kind of protecting our people. Like he thinks he's doing the right thing.
Let's do the right thing.
It's like, it's just so wacky. And China are all like these kind of weird utopian fanatics. Like, it's just so funny how satirical it is. And it's the same with the Red Alert 3. Like, Red Alert 3 it's just so wacky and so goofy.
Yeah.
I think for me, to answer my own question, I'm kind of torn between Zero Hour and Red Alert 3. Like, Zero Hour is obviously what we've done most of our content on, and it's where the name General Gentleman came from. But I mean, that mainly is just to do with casting with Blake, because he never played CNC3, he never played Red Alert 3. We played a lot of Generals together, so it was kind of something that we would do together. We would cast it. We grew this fan base around that. But personally, like, I probably played more Red Alert 3 online than I've played Zero Hour, and I think, you know, when I look at the design of Red Alert 3, like, it's just so elegant, and it has like the best kind of balance in terms of the way that infantry, aircraft, tanks, vehicles, and naval especially works. There's so much like really cool micro that's going on. Most units of probably all units are viable. There's so many flaws you can make about 0 Hour, like the faction design, certain frustrating mechanics that are in the game. So like it's kind of hard. Like when the question is what's your favorite, and it's like in which question, like the favorite one that you've enjoyed the most, the one that if you were stuck on an island and only had one CNC game, which would it be? But I think Red Alert 3 was the kind of the culmination of the series. It's where all of the lessons were learned from the other CNC games, and it all came together in the best way.
Yeah, definitely. I suppose that's why
kind of the cool thing about
it's struggled since.
Oh, go ahead, man.
Sorry, no, it's all yours, all yours.
I was just gonna say that's just kind of the cool thing about the series is that it's all this large progression, and going back to Command and Conquer specifically, it's like getting to the iteration of Command and Conquer 3 or even Kane's Wrath. We'll ignore Command and Conquer 4, pretend that never happened. It's very clear that you can see that they were learning from previous mistakes or using the new technology of today or back then to really push the limits of what the game was thought to be. And while they'd leave out certain elements, like one thing that I really miss from the old Command and Conquer days that I wish they would have included in CNC3 is like the old Devil's Tongues. I don't know if you remember those things, but they burrow underneath. Oh man, that was so great because you'd have to like lay out pavement on your base in order to prevent them from digging up and into your base and just blowing everything up. But they took interesting takes on it. Like they made that just a land-based vehicle that was just driving around. So it's been so interesting, and particularly with Red Alert 3 because the story, I think story-wise, the Red Alert series just being so far out of the realm of normal. It's the coolest one just story-wise. Command and Conquer has a great story, but I think that one's a little bit too believable in comparison to Red Alert.
Yeah.
And that's saying something.
I think Command & Conquer 3 just jumped the shark. Like in terms of the story, the story was so far out that they could get away with really creative unit design, like that otherwise would make no sense in a realistic universe. And it's kind of really enjoyable to have those wacky units of like those, what are they called, bullfrogs, shooting your own infantrymen.
Yeah, the transforming
giant circus
units.
Cannon.
I think you said Command and Conquer 3. You obviously meant Red Alert 3.
Yeah. Red Alert 3, obviously.
Yeah, like the dogs and like it was so crazy. And so what was interesting, I think about Red Alert 3, it was so underrated because I think a lot of people shat on it because of the art style. A lot of people when it came out, they were like, "Oh, it looks like it's so cartoony. It looks like it's kiddie-ish." But and I didn't initially like the art style at first either, but the thing is though is that art style, it reflects the gameplay. Because the unit design and the faction design is so wacky and goofy and cartoony and makes no sense, it would be a bit jarring. It'd be a bit dissonant to have this like really grim, dark, serious kind of art style. Like CNC3 has this grim, dark art style, but then to have these wacky, bright units, like it just wouldn't make sense. So I do like how they went with that art style, and also I think that art style ages really well. Like. In general, the more cartoony something is, the better it will age. If something tries to be realistic, it looks great at the time, but a few years later, it starts to kind of fall off.
Yeah, technological progression is going to make it obsolete unless it goes for a really cartoony look.
Yeah, it's a testament as well to how, especially on Red Alert 3, it doesn't take itself seriously. It doesn't need to take itself seriously. So why would you even bother making it feel realistic when the gameplay is going to be nothing like that? Especially when you look back at games like 0 Hour where they go for semi-realism, that fits because it's granted a little bit satirical, but a semi-realistic story. But Red Alert 3 is nowhere even close.
Yeah, even 0 Hour's aged very well too. The graphically, like it's been so long, and yeah, like it still looks gorgeous. Like. Obviously the quality technically isn't there, but just the way the units animate and just the way the units are, like there's something about it which just has aged well. And I think even in 10 years time we'll look back and go like that game's quite pretty just because of the art style and the way that the units work.
Yeah, agree.
Absolutely. Well, and going back to Will's point is it's like that was a game that knew what it was, very well. Again, I think that's a testament to the way that Command and Conquer has been done. Like 0 Hour knew what it was. They tailored the music, the art style, the gameplay, everything worked together. And I think that's probably the biggest thing that we just don't see anymore. It's like, you get titles like Grey Goo or Active Aggression where the game doesn't feel the same. Like you get the story, you get the music, and you get the game, and they all, while they have elements obviously that tie them together, they just don't have that same feeling that Command and Conquer does.
Yeah, it's like it feels like they've sat down and they've said, all right, guys, we should make an RTS game. What RTS game should we make? I don't know. How about we make it sort of like Command and Conquer, but like this? Whereas with the C&C games, like it really feels like from the start they had a very clear artistic vision of like what they wanted to do, how they're going to present it, and it just feels like it's a lot more properly developed. But that being said, like those games have been so rushed out as well. Like you can tell how premature they are in terms of like the balance, in terms of the faction design. Like the Command and Conquer Generals, the base game came out, I think it was March 2003. 0 Hour, I believe, came out like November that same year, 2003. So 0 Hour was developed over the course of like 6 months or a bit more than that.
Wow.
Yeah, like look it up on Wikipedia. I'm pretty sure it's like half a year.
There is so much cut content that just didn't make it into the game anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
Look at the Wikipedias.
Yeah, in the mod files.
0 Hour was end of September 2003.
And when was Generals?
So even less than you think.
Man, that's
It's nuts.
But I believe that was a bit more normal in older games, because like back then it wouldn't be that. It didn't take as long to develop games because the budgets weren't as high. There wasn't quite the expectations. But for Generals, yeah, like insane. As Five Aces was saying, the cut content. If you look through the mod files, there's like these sound effects, and these assets for all these units that weren't in the game, like Laser Ranger here, or like Laser Comanche here. Like the voice acting is there for these units, and there are certain mods that have actually taken those assets and turned them into playable stuff. Like even the Generals challenges, like the game launched without I think it was GLA Demo and China Inf. They're not in the game, but modders have taken parts of it and actually released it. I don't know how much they changed or like how much was usable, but like yeah, you can tell it's rushed out. And Red Alert 3, with Red Alert 3, there's no upgrades, like not a single upgrade in the game, and yet you can tell that they were going for it. You know how like every faction has that tech building. Allies is probably the most egregious because it doesn't do anything. You have the Battle Lab, the nanotech mainframe for Empire, and then the Allies, it's the Technology Bureau, the one that gives you the Prism Towers, and then in a later patch gave you the Tanya as well. But that building does nothing. It's just like you build the building and unlocks the Prism Tower, and that's it. It's like you can tell those upgrades going to be there, and as a result, it's like it feels like it's missing something because no upgrades. But it's also pretty impressive how much depth it has despite upgrades, and how everything scales well. Like early game units still are useful late game.
Right.
Yeah, everything has a bit of utility packed into it.
Yeah, and just the way the counter system works as well is like everything kind of works where not all games can do that. Like, in C&C 3, like, why would you build Predators when you can build Mammoths?
Well, I mean, there's plenty of reasons, and in fact, Mammoths are pretty rarely seen these days. I mean, they're coming back a little bit, but for the most part, actually, Predator tank spam is not a terrible strategy.
Really?
It's again, it's all dependent on the circumstances, but the other thing is that to the testament of what you were saying about Red Alert 3 as far as having upgrades, Command & Conquer 3 has a ridiculous number of upgrades.
Yeah, yeah.
Like almost every unit can be upgraded, and Predator tanks, just as an example, are a unit that you can build really early on, and are not terribly expensive, are very strong even early, and then once you get the railgun upgrade, which is a tech center upgrade, they become incredibly strong for an incredibly cheap price. And when you start stacking that up against like a mammoth tank, it's like, yeah, sure, a mammoth tank is really strong, but you've got to sacrifice a long build queue, and you have one slow unit versus potentially two quicker units that you could micro better. So there's some give and take. I will admit Command and Conquer 3 is not the best balanced game. However, the modding community has been great. People like CGF that have created community patches, and I'm not sure how it is over in 0 Hour or OpenRA. I mean, it sounds like OpenRA has gotten quite a bit of community patching done, but
yeah, it's inherently
that's what
friendly.
saved the game. Yeah, I mean the original 1.02 patch for Command and Conquer 3 is awful.
Yeah.
I mean, it's incredibly buggy. The balance is horrendous, and there's some units that just straight up don't work.
Like
so
what?
it's
Like the Zocom
the
Predator and
infantry.
stuff?
The Zocom Predator, I mean, there's a long list.
Yeah.
There's a long list, but yeah, Zocom Predators were bugged to the point where they were giving out a larger amount of veterancy, despite the fact that they were like the weakest tier 1 tanks. But it's just a litany of stuff like that, and there was Steel Talent Harvesters that moved slower.
Got what?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
That sounds balanced.
Yeah, it's interesting when you look at some games that have done incredibly well with modding. The best example I would say is actually Dawn of War 2. Dawn of War 2 Elite mod. That's huge. Yeah. That probably has equal to the same player base as the base game, but like all the good players are playing that Elite mod, and it's not just balance and bugs. It's like new units. There's actually even a new faction. They have like leaderboards. They have like all their replays posted. So it's a really neat community and what they've done with it. And I think the other best example, I don't play this personally, but I know it exists, is the Battle for Middle-earth 2, Wrath of the Lich King. Like that, I think that has a huge community patch thing. And C&C 3 is probably the best example. Like 0 Hour is interesting because 0 Hour has a community patch, the 1.6, because 1.4 is kind of the same as the Kane's Wrath 1.2, where it's just like this horrible balance. Some units just don't work. Some bugs in there. Not quite as bad though, because like the bugs have sort of been fixed by other community tools, which like Gentle, which is what you use for widescreen support and such, that also fix certain bugs. So it's not really a different patch. You can still play back and forwards, but it does fix some of those bugs. But with 1.6, it didn't really take off. It's gone through phases. Like when it first came out, people played it, and then it kind of got buried. And then when I kind of came onto the scene, then I was like, wow, this is amazing. I kind of brought it back for a little bit, but then went down again. And then like every now and again, someone runs a tournament, but like really no one plays it consistently. And I think part of the reason, because with Kane's Wrath 1.2 plus, it's a map, right? It's not like a mod.
Yeah, it's the way that it's done is as like map packs. So there's 3 or 4 different map packs. I forget now. People are gonna crucify me in the comments because I should know that. But the map packs. So there is a 1.02 plus patch that you can do. But what that does is that patches your entire game, so that way all of your games are played as 1.02 plus. And normally you'd think, hey, if I want to play on 1.02 plus, that's what I want to do. But the problem is and this is where I think honestly CGF did a great job, is that he recognized, or rather the community recognized, that it's like, hey, there's a large player base out there that just won't ever update.
Yeah.
But that will still play online, and they don't want to, they didn't want to get themselves separated entirely from that player base, because even though 1.02 is buggy, it's still playable to a certain extent, and you can still have fun with it. But for competitive purposes, 1.02 plus has just been so good. And yes, like you said, it's done as map packs. So in the map selection list, you'll have the standard map, and then there will be a 1.02 plus variant of that. So you're not forced to patch your entire game. You can still play the old versions. But you can also play on the bug fixed and slightly balanced versions.
Yeah, with 0 you don't have that, so it's a lot harder to install. And even though it's still like really simple, it's just that mental kind of energy that people just won't bother with it. But I think even more than that, I think like because 0 is such an old game, people are just so used to it and just don't like change. And you can objectively state all of the flaws with 0-hour 1.4, like that half the units are just trash, and if it isn't a Humvee, that you shouldn't build it. Because like you go USA, like you don't build tanks, you don't build aircraft. Like all you do is just build Humvees. Like you build aircraft obviously if you're like USA Air Force, but like for the most part it's just Humvees, and missile defenders, which you garrison inside the Humvees, and it's just like all you build. And yet people like that. And same with like GLA. Like there's only certain units you build. Same with China. It's kind of strange, right? Because in the way that it works in 0-hour is because of how limited the units are, where it's it's all Humvees, it's all outposts and helixes, it's all tech RPGs and quads and whatever. It means that it's very micro-oriented, like way more micro-oriented than the other CNC games, where there's a functional counter system. Because like you can't just go, oh, my opponent has Humvees, I'll counter him with my Humvee counter. Like you have MiGs, like there are a couple of things that kind of do, but it's not quite that simple. And so what that means is it's really all just about, can you out micro your opponent? Because you can't counter your opponent's composition. And so it's very skillful, and it's very micro intense, and it's very competitive, and it's fun to watch, and it can be fun to play. I think it's a lot less interesting when there's no strategy, and you can certainly have that level of micro without being so shoehorned and so limited in what you can do. But a lot of people just love that, and they just don't want to change.
I can see why, because it's like this high impact unit that if it works, if it gets some veterancy, if it gets some crucial snipes, you're feeling good about it, because you get rewarded for having this high impact unit at the right place at the right time. But if it fails, it fails horribly. So micro in general is a really, really big factor in 0-hour, and I think that's why people like it. It's not very macro oriented. You don't need to like build up your base or get out 5 expansions before you think about moving into your opponent. It's just you're thrown into the action from minute 1. I think that's a big part of the factor what makes it so enjoyable.
Yeah, but I disagree with that reasoning, because like you can still have micro, and having other units that are viable, like being able to build tanks, doesn't take away from Humvees being that kind of unit. Like it obviously makes them that they're weaker in the patch, but it's still the same game. It's just the same game with more variety and more options. And for some reason, a combination of the having to install the patch, the player base being small, people not wanting to change. There's some people that love it, other people don't, and for me that's kind of sad that people just don't want to play this 1.6 patch. But also then like 0-hour is very divided between the modding communities. Like you have Rise of the Reds, Shockwave, Contra, and like people play on Hamachi, especially for Shockwave. So you do have some people that take their desire for 0-hour in a different way, whereas I don't think the other CNC games have anywhere near the same level of modding.
There's a surprising amount of modding out there for CNC if you go and look for it. But as far as I think it's a matter of whether or not it's a competitive patch, just to put it into a broad term. And it kind of goes back to what you were saying, in that it seems like people are okay with staying with a particular meta because they're used to it. And again, taking your example from 0-hour, where Humvees, yes, they reward you for having good micro, and it's like, yes, that's a testament to skill to a certain degree. But again, exactly as you said, making some other unit viable does not de facto make this unit completely useless. It doesn't remove that factor of micro from the game. Yeah. And again, the reason that I think some of these patches, because we had a similar experience in CNC3, where 1.03, also created by CGF, the modder, he was trying to create a balance patch. So 1.02 plus is specifically intended to be a bug fix patch. It does have some minor balance changes, but in essence, it's meant to be 1.02. So the idea was not to really change the balance all that much, which I'm not sure why the community would want, because again, it sounds like we're of a like mind there, Machine, because I think a changing balance or a changing meta is really extremely good for a game's longevity.
Yeah.
It's just like look at games like League of Legends and Dota and even StarCraft to a certain extent. You know, the meta changes, they update the game, and you know, sure, maybe you get some balance changes that don't work out all that great, or maybe some units fall into obscurity, but it just changes things. It refreshes people's interest in the game. You have to learn something new.
Mm-hmm. It's
Yeah.
just very hard to get change done within a community because there's always going to be like this vocal minority who are absolutely against every change. It's like the same in OpenRA.
Spotty,
And when you're constantly redeveloped and refined, and there are always like for every change there's like 10 people are like, no, we can't do this because. Yeah.
Spotty, can you try like turning on and off and on your camera again? It seems to be like lagging. Like your voice is fine, but
really?
your camera like freezes for a certain amount.
I don't know how to turn off and on my camera.
There's like there's a button. Oh, it's fine now, but like it keeps kind of freezing up.
Okay. Well, if it keeps freezing, just let me know.
Okay.
I'll try to fix it. I'm not quite sure what I need to do.
But,
you're saying on Skype?
On Skype, yeah.
Let's try this.
It might break my overlay briefly. Yeah, there we go.
Right.
Hopefully that'll fix it.
Sorry.
It's back.
Yeah, like let's bring the example to Company of Heroes 2 so Will can join in. It's the exact same with Company of Heroes 2. Is like because we're currently in the process of getting the Winter Balance preview, which is like this patch that's been in development for I think like 5 months now. The people working on it are myself and 2 other community members who aren't getting paid, but it's like an official thing. And it like with being very limited in scope in terms of what we can change. Like we were given a limited list of like, okay, you can change these 10 things. You can't change anything else, even though these things are all broken as well. You can only do these things. And I'm on the argument with Sparty where it's like, if you change the meta, even if you end up breaking some things, you're gonna keep people's interest, keep them interested, because then it's a fresh new experience. Company of Heroes, people are burnt out from the stale meta, the same things being broken, overpowered for years.
Yeah, I agree. Change can be a really, really good thing, and it's actually necessary for a game's longevity. That much is absolutely true. It's just sometimes very hard to push it through.
We've found, especially with Company of Heroes, that there's so many commanders. Not that the commander system itself is probably flawed from the roots, but there's so many commanders that just aren't ever used.
Yeah.
To the point that we've had to reward people, especially Stormless has started rewarding people for going out of the meta. Do something that's different and you'll be rewarded for it. It's so strange that that's necessary, but I suppose with the older games, when we're going back as far as, say, the original Red Alert, and we're going back to Generals and 0 Hour, they have stayed popular because there are so many different options out there of play. The meta hasn't become stale, even though they are old. Which is why some people might be opposed to modding older versions of the game, because they like how you have something familiar to fall back on, but you still have the choice, you still have the option of how you play.
Well, not in 0 Hour. I mean, 0 Hour, like, the meta is so stale, and you only can build X amount of units per faction. But it's a testament to why it is still popular, because people just love that micro skill ceiling. So it's like, it doesn't need necessarily to have a variety of meta to make it interesting, because the micro itself makes it interesting. But Co is a different example, right? Because Co just doesn't have that level of micro. Co is mainly, it's more about strategy and decision making and tactics. So when you have a game like Company of Heroes that doesn't have that level of micro, and you do have such a stale, stagnant meta, people will get bored, and people are bored. Like, there's not many top players left. There's only a handful. And I guess you could make the same argument for Red Alert 3. Like, the meta there isn't quite as bad because all the units function properly, but at least it still does have that level of micro and that harassability to keep people interested.
Well, it's funny on this subject of like feeling like a stale meta. We just recently had like a big upheaval in C&C 3, particularly in Kane's Wrath, and less so in Tib Wars, but it's happening. Is that the community is kind of coming together and saying, hey, we are getting kind of tired of the fact that Black Hand just wins every game.
Yeah.
You know, that going into a tournament, a player is really taking it upon themselves to potentially take a loss by playing anything other than the overpowered faction. And again, that's a result of the particular meta. You know, yes, you know, balance is obviously involved there, but I think regardless, you know, Command and Conquer and just RTS in general, it's such a complicated set of equations to try to balance the game that I don't think you'll ever achieve a perfect balance. I don't know that you could point to a single game that has a perfect balance unless it has exactly the same units on either side, and then you get into that realm of it's stale. And you know, the big thing with the community was we had a large tournament that had like over $1,000 worth of cash prizes, and again, everybody saw that it was just this Black Hand spam fest, and you know, everybody was like, all right, maybe this is the tipping point where we go, okay, maybe it's time to change the meta. It's really strange for me because like I've been here for a few years and I've just accepted the fact that Black Hand was the meta, and it seemed like the community was okay with that, as much as I would love to see variety myself. But it was amazing to see like everybody come to that same realization all at once, where it's like, okay, now we need to make something happen. And you know, R12, which is our version of the new version of 1.02 plus, was born as a result of that. Albeit it does still have its own problems, but for the most part, it's made some changes and it's refreshed people's interest in the game again. So I really wish that these older communities would embrace the idea of changing things a little bit. And no, you don't need to change so much from the original game that you lose sight of what it was. Just make some changes, maybe adjust some balances here and there, make a faction that was maybe unplayable before playable, maybe even overpowered to a certain extent. And it just refreshes people's interest in the game again.
With that in mind, something that I keep thinking back to, I stuck it open on the page because I was intrigued about the date of it. One of the games I grew up with in particular, which probably got me into RTSs in the first place, was Age of Empires 2. And there were races within that game that remained broken for nearly 15 years until it became a HD remake and
Which ones?
the community patch. The Teutons in particular. The Teutons could build a town centre in the enemy town centre and be completely undefeatable because theirs had longer range. So you could essentially snipe villagers. It was horrendous. But there was always a gentleman's agreement that if you are playing this in a tournament, yes, you can play whatever race you want as long as it isn't the Teutons. And people followed that rules. You'd be banned if you tried to play as them. But as soon as the HD remake came out, the patch that fixed that, the community patch, which put new races in, called the Forgotten, that was released as a real expansion pack. So the community made it, and it was sold on Steam, and there's been 2 more expansion packs out since then. So the game was made in '99, and it's still having content released for it today. But the main difference, I suppose, in that is that in older games like Age of Empires, all of the races are built on the same structure. Whereas in Command & Conquer, there are noticeable difference in how unique all the different playable races are, which is their design choice. But it's one that comes with a large amount of risk. If you want to make your teams different, there's always going to be some imbalance there.
Yeah, asymmetry is a word that I get triggered by because so many people look at it the wrong way. Like people see asymmetry as a tick on a box that says this game has asymmetric factions. Great, that's a good thing. And it's like, well, hold up. Asymmetry is not a feature. Asymmetry is a tool that needs to be used delicately in order to create more strategic diversity and more variety within the factions. There's so many games that actually are more stale and the factions are shoehorned and the plays are limited because of asymmetry. The best example is Company of Heroes, the way that the factions designed, where like USA, USF as they're called, is objectively overpowered early game, but then they're awful late game. And that's the opposite, sort of with like OKW, which have... So it's like in C&C, you guys you maybe haven't played Co. You have 3 levels of veterancy, right? You have Vet 1, Vet 2, Vet 3. Well, not OKW. They have 5. So everyone else vets up 3 times. OKW vet up 5 times.
You know what's funny? That's even on the box. Like if you purchase the game on Steam, it lists this as a feature. Like it shows you the different races, and it shows you like the Brits.
Yeah.
Are strong from this to this time in the game.
This faction is more flexible. Like what? Yeah,
this faction is gonna be stronger later. So fuck you, basically.
yeah. Deliberately designing factions like that, not to conflate that, which is just bad design, with asymmetry as a concept, but like that's an example where asymmetry, gone badly is a bad thing.
Yeah. I think what upsets me the most about that is that it was always the playable races in Company of Heroes that came later.
Yeah.
So the Soviets and the Wehrmacht, the Austere to begin with, they weren't perfect, but when the game was balanced and patched a few times, in Company of Heroes 2, it worked. The same with the Wehrmacht in the US in the original Company of Heroes. Eventually they worked and they were pretty well balanced. But as soon as you bring expansions in, as soon as you bring DLC in, all that has to start all over again. All that effort that is made by the community and the devs to make those playable races work together is ripped up and rebuilt, and we're left with a situation where the UK and the Commonwealth in Company of Heroes and the UKF in Company of Heroes 2 are the most broken races because they were brought in last.
Yeah. And on top of that, you had the DLC for that DLC faction, which is then makes them specifically overpowered.
Yeah.
That's the trap that many microtransaction-based games fall into. So I think it's the same for like League of Legends. They bring in a new champion nowadays it's like every half a year probably. And that champion needs to be good and viable and even overpowered at the release, just so people purchase him. Otherwise, they're going to watch videos, tutorials, and be like, no, this guy's shit, I'm not buying this.
Yeah, it happens sometimes with League, but the difference with League is yes, they release a champion, it's overpowered, it gets patched. It doesn't happen in Company of Heroes. They release a new faction or a new commander, and it stays it stays overpowered for so long. And
we're still picking up the pieces now, aren't we? It's
and like there are some things that it's like not deliberately overpowered, but then there are other things which you can objectively state this is just better. And like, probably the best example is you look at the repair speed times. The old factions, Soviets and Wehrmacht, they repair slower, like just objectively. Like the number, like how fast they repair is lower than everyone else. Like something as objective and stat based as repair speed. Like there's no level of strengths and weaknesses and like different perspectives. It's repair speed. Like there's no way around that. And that's quite frustrating. But moving back to what Sparty said like 20 minutes ago about like how like balance can never really be perfected, and that there's always going to be a meta, and it's like that's true, but the thing is you're always narrowing it down. And I actually had this conversation with a Company of Heroes 2 dev when I was in Vancouver. He was a cool guy, but I just he triggered me with what he said that. And basically because I was talking about some of the balance problems, because this was for a tournament that we casted, and it was like so stale meta, like it was a really like it was an amazing event, but like the game specifically were just shitty games because it was just like very meta kind of shit. And and I was talking about that, and he was like, well, there's always going to be a meta. Players will always exploit the overpowered thing. So what's the point, right? Like, what's the point in even balancing it? And like that's such an idiotic thought process, because what happens is yes, you always have a meta. People find the strongest thing, but every time, so long as your patches are good, which for a long period of time they haven't been in Company of Heroes 2, where things are overbuffed and over-nerfed, you're lowering it down. So it's like this faction is 60% stronger than this faction. Okay, well now this faction is 30% stronger than this faction. Now this faction is 20% stronger. So like, yeah, you do vary the meta and what's OP and what's not, but if you're balancing it and patching it properly, you will be lowering the gap between them.
Mm-hmm. Right, and to clarify my statement, because I don't want it to come off as though
I'm
trying to advocate against balance. I'm actually saying the exact opposite. I'm saying because the nature of balance is so volatile that you'll almost never achieve that perfect state of balance. Some may argue that you can, but accepting that nothing will ever be completely balanced, that just is more reason to constantly update the game. to make these small adjustments, see if you can get that level of perfection, get it as close as you can, because even if it's 0.1% better, it's still better or different, or it. And especially with these old games, it sounds like Co has a bit more of a player base, but with these older games, we're fighting the war of time. It's like players are disappearing; they're not coming in. And as much as the group of us casters can start pumping some life into the game, it's still we're fighting a downhill battle. So it's the only way, I think, to keep these games alive is to just add some variety and keep them interesting. And again, I don't think you're going to solve that problem of bringing new players in, at a faster rate than you're losing the older players. But at least you'll be able to maintain it for a bit longer and enjoy it for as long as you can.
I think with Zero Hour in particular, but all the other RTS, other CNC games, is that it'll get to a stage where it's going to be really hard to find games and there won't be a lot of people playing. It already is, right? But there will always be people watching Shoutcast. People are not going to play it, but they still want to watch the games, like Zero Hour, OpenRA, CNC, because of the nostalgia. Just in general, some people that don't even like play games that much anymore, but still want to get some of it. Like I reckon probably the majority of my viewers for Zero Hour, that is, actually don't play Zero Hour, but they watch it. Newer games like Co would be a bit different. You'd probably have most of them are players. CNC3, maybe that's the same. I don't know, but so long as there's enough replays and there's like tournaments where you don't have to always have consecutive players, consistent players, but at least if you have things going every now and again, there'll be replays to cast and people will keep coming back for the content. But yeah, sooner or later, eventually the games will die. Though it is impressive that they haven't, despite the servers going down. Like you would think that losing the servers would result in that.
Well, but to give a an unintended plug, but a very due plug, is CNC Online was the savior of all of these older games, because I don't know how Zero Hour works. I think you guys also use CNC Online, but oh my God, if that had not come along, this community was gone. Command & Conquer 3 and Kane's Wrath would have been splintered across 4 different LAN emulating softwares, that it would have just been gone. Because when we were looking at the imminent demise of GameSpy, it was terrifying, because I was actually going through and testing all of these different services like Evolve and Tungle and I forget the other one.
Game Ranger is the main one.
Game Ranger, that's the one I hate. Game Ranger, but it's like the services were so bad in comparison to just being able to click a button and press play. To have to install some kind of LAN emulating software that is screwing with your outgoing IP address. Turn it off. The internet. It's like, oh my God, it was such a mess. And CNC Online just saved it. So big shout out to Revora guys. I can't thank them enough. I mean, without them, the games would have been gone.
Yeah, that's true. Also, like, I don't know what their server costs are. Like, I don't know if they're actually losing money on keeping these games alive. And I know, it's certainly not making money by any means. I know they'll probably get some donations, but like they probably are losing money to keep these games alive. I think that they also do like Battle for Middle Earth, and there are a few others too. So it is certainly great, and it's also the momentum, like because CNC Online was there pretty much as to take the place immediately. Whereas if the servers went down and then like a year later they were like, oh look guys, we have this thing, it'd be people would have moved on. Whether it's moving on to those VPN programs like Hamachi that you mentioned, or whether it's just a new game in general, it would have been too late. But it means that it was able to keep going without people losing interest. So that's certainly a good point. I know for Zero Hour at least, there's so many tournaments because there isn't that many people playing online. Instead, people are resorting to tournaments, but there's a lot of money on the line too. Like there's just so many of them all the time. They're always coming, and for a caster, it's great. Like people often say, "Are you gonna run out of replays?" And like, hell no. Like actually, since the servers went down, we have more replays. We have more tournaments. There's less games happening in general, but because there's more tournaments, it just means it's better and more replays for us to cast.
Yeah, tournaments in general or competitive events are just a great way of keeping the community together and keeping it a cohesive community together. Like it's a one of the most crucial parts I think about RTS, because it's an inherently competitive genre. It's not like a, don't know, a building simulator or anything like that. It's just inherently competitive, and you need to have those tournaments going. You need to have a competitive scene. You need to have people who find and exploit those like balance flaws. It's yeah.
All right, so
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna move the subject on to talking about like Grey Goo or whatever. Do you want to wrap something up first?
No, actually, I'd love to talk about Grey Goo because I know it triggers you. And,
Oh, I get so triggered, man. Yeah. All right. Will, did you play Grey Goo?
You know, I've not actually. No. It's one of those that's completely passed me by.
Good.
But I've heard plenty from you.
Yeah. All right. Do you guys have anything to say about Grey Goo, Sparty?
Oh, I've got lots to say.
So let's hear it. Let's hear it. Okay.
I'll go last.
5 aces.
I'll go last.
I've never played it. I just watched your video, and that kind of formed my opinion on it.
Oh, okay. All right. It's all you, man. It's all you.
All right. So, Grey Goo, I accept that it is a failed game, as it is. However, the potential that was there, the potential that I think still is there, is astronomical. Because when we talk about all these C&C clones or new games coming into the RTS genre, there's really nothing that has even come close to Command and Conquer, and it's left a huge market. Like the entirety of the players playing Kane's Wrath and Tib Wars and some of the older games, I imagine if there was another Command and Conquer similar game that came out like Grey Goo, that had a good storyline, had great music compositions, had interesting unit designs, things like that, that all melded together and had a fun single player experience and a fun online multiplayer experience, then it would be great. But Grey Goo, it had all of those elements ready to go, but they just failed on the execution of all of it. And it just seemed like they were trying to get it out at a particular time without having the whole vision set out in front of them, and it collapsed under its own weight as a result. I mean, it's very clear that they spent a fair amount of money on that game. When you look at some of the cutscenes and stuff that they put together that are all animated and stuff.
No,
it's like
I need to interject. I need to interject here because I said the exact same thing in my review. But I actually spoke to the CEO of the company I work for, Stardock. Actually hired one of the ex-producers from Grey Goo. Apparently, those cutscenes didn't take any of their budget. Something to do with like the way the guy that owned the company that did that was a fan of the Grey Goo concept. Like I don't remember what the reasoning was, but apparently those cutscenes didn't actually take their budget away, which is what I thought initially too, because those cutscenes were gorgeous.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's more of a testament to where the money was spent, but I don't know that changes anything. It's like the cutscenes were amazing, like you said, they were incredible. And it's what you would expect in today's day and age. You wouldn't look for cutscenes from older games.
Dude, I would.
I mean, Command and Conquer, the cutscenes from back then, the live action, you don't get that anymore. No. You couldn't get the budget for something like that anymore. I think the only company that could realistically do that is EA. They're the only powerhouse out there that has the money to be able to fund something like that. But I guess getting back to Grey Goo, is that the game just had so much interesting changes to it as far as how RTS was kind of viewed. And again, I know that you were saying asymmetry for the sake of asymmetry is bad. However, I think Grey Goo had the most asymmetry, well, almost the most asymmetry that I've seen of any modern RTS, and had a potential to balance it, but they just couldn't figure it out. And yeah, I don't know. I haven't really paid too much attention to the game since I lost touch with it. Probably almost a year ago now. But it's just it had so much potential and just couldn't deliver. And I can't place my finger on what it was.
Didn't they release an expansion? I think it had a new faction or something.
They probably did.
It looks like they have. Yeah, they got a campaign.
Emergence campaign. Yeah, I think the thing is with Grey Goo is it really was the first of this wave of like shitty new RTS games post C&C. Because then after that, you know, there's been Active Aggression, there's been 8-Bit Armies, Deserts of Karak, but Grey Goo like really was the first one, so that had the most hype and most anticipation of all the like the C&C players and just RTS players in general. Like you said, all the C&C players are looking for a new ship to jump on board with. Company Heroes are the same. So many people that play that game play it begrudgingly because I don't like StarCraft 2 and there's something else to play. Where it's like, if there is a new RTS game that is good, not only will they get all of these C&C players, they'll get all these Company of Heroes players. I'd imagine the similar can be said for like Age of Empires players that are kind of burnt out from Age of Empires 2 being 15 years old. So there's this huge gap in the market, which just no one is trying to do. And since people got burnt out, not burnt out, like did let down essentially. There's a word I can't think of, but they got so let down by Grey Goo being crappy that they kind of lost the hype anymore. Like then Active Aggression came out, that still had a bit of hype going behind it, but then that kind of fell off. People were like, ugh. And then by the time Halo Wars 2 came out, people just kind of stopped caring. People have kind of accepted that RTS is in this stagnant state where no one knows how to make good RTS games anymore. Whereas for a while there, people were very optimistic about Grey Goo. Part of it being the petroglyph, the X-Westward thing. Part of it being like it looked kind of nice. But yeah, that game had so many problems. And apparently the engine was really, really screwy and messed up with what they wanted to do. But just like the way the units were designed, overall, I think the main one to describe Grey Goo is just bland. There's just the units, the sounds, the faction. Like the Goo faction is kind of this unique thing that's like, wow, that's cool. But like just the other factions, just the way that the units walk, the way that they fire, the names of the units, like it's just so forgettable. Like I honestly can't remember any other units other than Dagger. And the reason why I remember the word Dagger is because I made a point in my review that the names weren't intuitive for what the units represented. Dagger was the stealth detection unit. So you would reveal stealth with a dagger, not a radar van, not a, I can't think of other examples, but like, you know, most RTS games, the units are intuitive of what that unit does. You know, like Shadow Team, right? Like you kind of get the idea of what that is about. There's plenty of examples where like good naming conventions help identify the unit. But like with Grey Goo, the names were arbitrary. The visuals were arbitrary. Like you got every unit in a line, and you had no idea what was anti-air, what was tank, what was artillery, what was like self-attack. They all looked this generic sci-fi floaty thing.
Yeah, and you know, like you were saying, I don't know that the naming conventions would be enough of a hang up for me to say, you know, the game failed because of that. But again, I think what you were getting at is it's a culmination of things. Like some very strange design choices where it's like you said, the unit, the looks of the unit and the feel of them, and you know how they move and how they operate, and I don't know. Particularly with Grey Goo, it felt like they went for that asymmetry route, but then realized balance-wise that they would struggle to get it done, and then tried to like shoehorn in all of these units that like fit in to allow them to say, okay, this unit is comparable to this unit, instead of fully embracing we're gonna create 3 entirely asymmetric factions, and you're gonna have to play them differently, and there's not gonna be a 1-to-1 counter. And they didn't do that. I can understand why their reluctance was there, because you know a typical command and conquer player, it's like you think of a Scorpion tank versus a Predator tank. That's like a comparable thing. It's like, yes, objectively speaking, a Predator tank is stronger than a Scorpion tank, but there's that 1-to-1 ratio. But with such an asymmetrical set of factions, you can't use that same design philosophy and expect to find success.
Yeah, and with the Goo faction, like the way that their economy worked was like they would split off their goo and it would build things, and like that was cool. But the actual units were the same. Like once you would do that, you would then identify, oh wait, so this unit is basically the same unit as that unit. And like that's fine. Like, you know, CNC3 does that, but in CNC3 it actually, in Zero, like it actually matters. So like in CNC3, to take the example of the Scorpion, it's like, yeah, the Predator's better, but the Scorpion's faster, so it can crush infantry better. It can harass harvesters better. It actually adds tangible differences to the asymmetry. Whereas Grey Goo, yeah, like the units were just so samey and so bland. And anyway, so what about active aggression? Do you guys play that? 5 or Will?
I haven't actively played it, but I've watched a couple of videos on it.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm the same.
Wow, man, you guys aren't contributing. What about 8-bit Armies? Did you play that?
Yes, like 2 games or something like that.
Okay. What do you think of it?
Extremely mediocre. It was, like you said, everything was so generic. You had like your attack helicopter. Well, it's an attack helicopter. No surprises here. No hidden backhand or anything. It's it was so. It just felt to me like it was trying to recreate the nostalgia of the original Command and Conquer, but then it completely forgot about the design. Like the design was so lackluster that was what turned me completely off this game.
And the name was literally attack helicopter.
Yeah,
like that was the name of the unit.
There was like there's like the defensive turret. What was it? I think it was just called
machine gun
turret.
Yeah,
or
something like that.
Turret, yeah.
I don't know.
It's the same idea that we were mentioning earlier, that one thing that makes Command and Conquer so good is its personality. It's the idea that it is satirical, it is funny, it doesn't take itself seriously, and every single unit has its own voice lines that gives it that personality. And it's just so lacking in other modern RTS games.
Yeah, but even in the old Red Alert 1, that is, it had personality. Like, for example, if you take OpenRA, you now have those. You have those bunkers, the pillboxes. You surely remember those. But they are not actually just defensive turrets. You can also like undeploy or ungarrison the rifleman and put a bazooka infantry in there.
Cool.
Or stuff like that. So it still has a bit of personality to it. It's not just this generic stat stick that stands here and shreds infantry.
Yeah, I think the sound effects were the main thing for me. Is like those screams, like the crushing sound. Like it was just so over the top. And
Tesla coil.
Yeah. And all the RTS games take themselves too seriously. Like one of my favorite recent RTS games is Offboard Trading Company. It's a very different style of RTS. Full disclaimer: I work for the company who published Offboard Trading Company. But I wrote my review before they even sponsored my channel and before I started working for them. But basically, it's really wacky and it's like really goofy, and like the tutorial is just full of these stupid jokes. The announcer, like the game is not taking itself seriously, and I think too many games try to do that, and as a result, it just kind of it loses the personality of it. But
doesn't the announcer occasionally even offend you if you do something stupid?
Not
like in a mean way, but it just berates you. It's kind of
not really. No. But there's like options and
because
stuff.
you've never done anything stupid.
Yeah, of course. No, the game's really hard. I've made a lot of mistakes. Did you play Active Aggression, Sparty?
I did actually, and it's funny because I was gonna try to circle things back there because I feel like we breezed past two subjects.
Yeah.
It's like Active Aggression and 8-bit Armies were also kind of came out in a similar time frame, I would say, as Grey Goo. I think Grey Goo preceded all of them, but they all came out in a relatively same stretch of time. Excuse me. But Active Aggression was interesting because it was very opposite from Grey Goo in the sense that Grey Goo, it was very obvious that it was a game that it was playing on the sci-fi roots. It wasn't trying to be realistic. It was trying to it was just trying to be its own game. Whereas it felt like Active Aggression was kind of, it was in that tough spot where it had to be realistic in order for it to be interesting and to make the visual fidelity work. And I think that's what made that game difficult, is because you're dealing with this situation where you've got nuclear silos and they go and they blow up a large area, but they don't destroy the entire map like you would with certain other games. But it it was interesting to see the difference between the three of those games, because you get active aggression, which was like this ultra realism, while there was still some elements of it that were a little bit bizarre. It was definitely meant to be more realistic. But then you get to a game like 8-Bit Armies, which was the exact opposite, I would say, from Grey Goo in a sense of asymmetry, where 8-Bit Armies was literally, the factions were exactly the same. It was blue versus red, but literally the same units, same buildings, everything. And I guess active aggression, I can't really put my finger on why I didn't like it. I think it's just the scale and the fact that the game just felt so different from what I'm used to. I don't know that I would necessarily say that it's a bad game. It was so out of the realm of what I liked in an RTS that it just didn't interest me. But I'm sorry, but 8-Bit Armies, it seemed like there was a lot more potential there, especially since they went with such a simplified art style that, even if you're using one faction and keeping the units exactly the same 1-to-1, add some abilities for those units. Add like a QWER set of abilities for those units, or even just a simple single ability for each unit. It just makes the gameplay that much more interesting and adds for some outplay.
Yeah, with 8-Bit Armies, it's interesting because already there's going to be people that are like, well, actually, 8-Bit Invaders came out, and now there's 6 factions. And it's like, look, I paid $15 for this game. I had one faction. I had like 8 units. That's what I got. And I don't give a shit if they release these new things later, some of which were free, some of which weren't. Like, that's what I played. It was lacking in content. It lacked in features. It was bland. It was crappy. The game is out. The game is released. Like, you can't hide behind this wall of, yeah, but they're adding more things in later. And so many people on my review were saying that, were like, yeah, but nah, there's more factions coming. They're not here now, and I'm sure there's way more varieties, way more things, but it's beyond the point of relevancy. Like, I don't care anymore. And it's the exact same with active aggression. I don't know if you heard, but they released a couple of years ago, they released this, like, this updated version where it was like a whole new kind of game where they realized, yeah, our game sucked, but we rebooted it, we tried again, and they redid the economy. Like, in active aggression, there was 3 resources. But the resources system was it was really bizarre. It was like a CNC3 sort of style game, but you had,
it was
like,
way worse than that.
Yeah, but it's like there was 2 main resources. There was like aluminum and oil, I think it was, and but like the costs of these units were so arbitrary. Like what would cost those resources was really all over the place. Right. It felt like 2 resources again, like asymmetry. 2 resources was not a tool. It was, a feature on a box to tick. It was just no consideration was taken in. And then they had a 3rd resource, which was used for, like, super weapons or, like, the high tier units or whatever. Like, it was... Those resource systems just did not work. And then they removed that in this new version. And, like, you could play both. It was, like, on Steam. I think there's, like, 2 versions I have. Like, if I look at it now, I have active aggression, but I think there's, like, when you launch it, you can choose which one you want to play. And so, yeah, it's like, at least they realize the failures of their game, but, like, and I'm sure it'd be a lot better, but it's just beyond the point of relevancy. Like, I don't care, and you lose momentum. Like, communities in RTS games and in any game in general is so momentum based. If you mess up your launch, people won't stick around. They'll move on. Even in a genre that is so starved as RTS, people move on. And a good example is Deserts of Karak, which, like, actually was a good RTS game. Like, I genuinely enjoyed that game, the Homeworld prequel, and it had, very distinct personality. It really knew what it was trying to be. The launch was just messed up. There was this thing, it was like region locked multiplayer, but it didn't tell you that. And so you would go to play a game, at least for me in my Australian region, and there was just no one online. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's weird. And you could play with people on your Steam, so I played some games with a couple of people, and it seemed okay. But, like, it seemed like the game was dead because it was region locked, but it was hidden. And it had, like, all these balance problems where there was, like, for the mirror, Gaussian versus Gaussian, you couldn't progress past the first unit, the sand skimmer, because, like, any other unit, like, would just basically lose because you would get so many of them. It's kind of like, say, like, in CNC3 you have attack bikes, right? It's like, and any other time you tried to put a new unit, it just wouldn't really work because you wouldn't get a counter to the attack bikes until you would kind of tech up a little bit, but you can't get to that stage because if you do, you just lose all your economy. So like they had some balance problems when it was launched. It had like really bad lag problems too. Like if there was a little bit of lag, like it would just mess it up. Like the netcode wasn't very good. And that game got fixed, and I've heard it's a really good game, and I liked the premise of it, but I just don't care anymore. It's too late. No one plays it. The game's dead. And I think that's just so important, is having a good launch, which just not many games do.
Yeah, and that's exactly the problem, isn't it? Is it's like these games like Grey Goo and Active Aggression and 8-Bit Armies, I will never go back and play those games. I mean, I may go back and screw around with them on single player or something like that, but I'm never going to look into that game as a competitive game. Certainly not going to invest hundreds of, if not thousands of hours into a game like that. And it's exactly like you said. It's because it just had a failed launch. And it's the strange thing that these publishers are dealing with now, is it's like you've got all the time in the world to create these RTS games. You don't have to give any information. It's not like you're dealing with a lot of competitors in this genre. There's no good alternative to Command and Conquer or StarCraft. There's just not. You've got Company of Heroes, which is it's in its own right a cool game, but it's even that doesn't match up to the player base that you see in Command and Conquer and StarCraft 2, especially StarCraft 2. And it's just, they should be, not to tell these developers what they should be doing, because they understand this better than I do, but it's like, it seems like all of this stuff should be ironed out well before launch. And sure, you're going to run into some problems, but you shouldn't have, structural problems with your server setup and like dealing with latency issues, and also having issues of like being region locked. Like that's, I mean, in 2017 we're being region locked.
Yeah, like it couldn't have been intentional. They'd fix that soon after, like not after long, like a week or two. But by then, like people stopped playing, right? I mean, the important thing is not to conflate developer and publisher, because no developer is like, yeah, let's launch our game before it's ready. It's the publisher that basically holds the developer hostage and says, you're over budget. We've paid you this much money. We don't care. We need this return on investment. We need it launched by X date. So it's kind of it's sad that the way that publishers really screw over the developers.
I'm curious, since you're kind of in this scene now, and you probably have a better idea of how this stuff operates. But so when a game concept comes up, is it the publisher that contacts the developer and asks them to move along with that?
No. The developer would poach it. The developer would like, we have this really cool idea. Please give us money. Please.
Right.
And then the publisher is like, fine, here's X million dollars. Go make this game. And then they'll set a budget. They'll set a timeline. They'll set like a certain date. And basically, the developer will have to follow certain deadlines, follow certain timelines. And that's why Generals 2, we haven't even talked about that yet. Generals 2 basically was aborted, and it's not because of what they tell you. It's not because of people on the forums saying it's because the game sucked. Like, no, the reason why it got aborted is because it went over budget. Basically, Frostbite, the engine that EA use for everything now, even though it seems to only be designed and good for FPS games. If you guys have seen the shitstorm with the Mass Effect Andromeda animations on the face, it just looks so dumb. It's like, and they're probably trying to shoehorn this engine onto Mass Effect. But anyway, with this Generals 2, is they tried to use this engine because it's like half a marketing piece, really. It's like the Frostbite engine, Battlefield 3 was pretty, therefore this game will look pretty as well because the same engine. I'm sure there's other reasons, but it took so long for them to try and get Generals 2 to work on this engine because it wasn't designed for RTS. And then so what happened is they were originally going to can it, Generals 2. And then what happened is the lead the game designer or whoever was in charge of the project basically went to the Supreme EA overlords and was like, no, please, if you don't scrap it, what we can do, how about this? How about instead of Generals 2, we make it a free-to-play game. We don't have to put any campaign in. We can release it early. We can launch it lacking in content and features because it'll be a free-to-play game. And then the publisher was like, all right, fine. You can have you can keep going. So that's when it turned from Generals 2 into Command and Conquer as like this vague kind of new free-to-play platform thing. That's when that shift happened because of that. And then they released it in alpha, and it was just bad. It was just awful, and regardless of any design flaws, because it was a shitty StarCraft clone. It was not a CNC game by any means. It had effectively Vespene gas. Like the way that the supplies and the oil worked was analogous to minerals and Vespene gas. It was just so bad. But more importantly is the units just didn't work. Like the pathing, infantry would skate, like they would, and like trees, like tanks would like drive over trees, and like they sort of ironed that shit out, but it just wasn't working on a technical level. And then basically on the forums, everyone was like, man, this game is like, this is not ready. And then the developers were like, yeah, well, we'll release it when it's ready. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, it was like, all right, guys, we're going into beta in a month. And everyone was like, what the fuck? Like, no. And then like 2 days later, Generals 2 was cancelled. RIP. The entire studio was fired. Everyone lost their jobs. So like, obviously what happened is the publisher was like, well, EA. I mean, it's all EA, but like the higher ups of the company was like, okay, you need to release this game by this date. And then the developers were like, well, it's not ready. And they were like, okay, well, you cancelled then. The project's over. So I mentioned this before in like a video specifically, but I think it's relevant because people will bring it up otherwise. But yeah, so the publisher always kind of holds the developers' mercy when it comes to like launch day and release day and shit like that and budget.
Right, but
really...
but sorry. Just because I'm like sitting on the edge of my seat here.
Was the story that compelling?
I guess I don't. I don't want to come off as though I'm like anti-developer here, but I don't think that we can necessarily take the onus off of the developer by just saying, well, the publisher told them they had to get it out by a certain date and it wasn't ready, so it's all the publisher's fault. It's like, no, in the respect of ignoring generals for the moment, because I don't understand the politics of what went down there, but looking at like a small developer today, if they were creating a new CNC or a new RTS game just in general, the developer comes up with the idea, they start working on the game, they show proof of concept to a publisher trying to get it. They're essentially investors, let's refer to them as what they actually are. And as a result, that publisher expects to see a return on their investment. You can't fault them for that. They're trying to make some money. And I think the onus is on the developer nowadays to understand the climate that they're in, that you're fighting with these free-to-play games, that you're dealing with these different business models now in gaming, where creating a one-and-done game and just walking away from it and moving on to another one is not a business model that's going to do very well. Not for longevity, that's for certain. And there's certainly a lot of potential in free-to-play, but it's tough to get that to work in an RTS space. Especially with microtransactions.
That's an interesting discussion. Is why microtransactions doesn't really translate so well into RTS. So we can talk about Company Heroes as an example there, but yeah, they're right. Like, I'm not trying to alleviate the blame. Like, Generals 2, as I said, was a terrible game. Like, it was a shitty StarCraft 2 clone. Regardless of its technical problems, it was a shitty StarCraft clone. Despite all the marketing, and everyone flamed that game on the forums. Like, the marketing so hard was, going back to the roots. We're bringing you the original RTS CNC experience. And it was marketed from the start as this traditional CNC thing. So then all the CNC players were like, yeah, and they played it and they're like, wait, this is a shitty StarCraft 2 clone. What the fuck? And same with Grey Goo. Like I mentioned how apparently they had engine issues, but like it doesn't excuse them for that. Their unit design sucked. Their gameplay sucked. Like, I think things aren't always that simple in terms of like, oh, well, it's only because of X reason. It's like, well, no, it's probably because of multiple things.
I have a question here. Is it do you guys think that the implementation of like Kickstarter is going to make the situation better for the developers, because it actually cuts out the middleman, it cuts out the developer, at least sort of?
I mean, dude, that is a whole can of worms. Like Planetary Annihilation, that game got so much in its Kickstarter, and that was kind of back when kickstarting was cool before everyone got burnt out from getting ripped off, like the FTL kind of era. But I didn't play that game, Planetary Annihilation, but I heard like the game just kind of sucked at launch, and it delivered on a lot of these features and promises and things like that. Apparently, the expansion Titan is a lot better. I don't know. I haven't played it. Don't really care, to be honest. And also, Planetary Annihilation, full disclosure, is a competitor of Ashes of Singularity, which I work for now. But yeah. But okay, I love Supreme. I love Supreme Commander. But Planetary Annihilation, like the way that it was the map was a sphere. So like how you'll be playing and like you have to pan around the sphere, like that game, it had issues. But like to answer your question, no, I don't think so, because kickstarting is very, very hit and miss. And the problem with the thing is with developers are video game developers. Developers aren't necessarily good at managing finances and managing funds. That's what publishers do. They do that. So like you can't just give a whole bunch of money to a developer and they'll know how to use it and they'll use it effectively. So I think if there was going to be a good Kickstarter RTS, it would have happened by now. That being said, there is still room for it. Like, I think that there's room for people to deliver like a really authentic successor to Generals. And there's been a lot of games that have claimed that they're going to. Like, Active Aggression said that they were inspired by Generals. And there's like how? Like, if anything, it's like C&C 3 more so than Generals. And there's this new game coming out soon. It's like Conflict Middle East or Warzone Middle East. But that's like really indie. That's like 1 or 2 man studio. So I don't think that'll be any good. But it looks okay. Like, it looks kind of Generals-y. But it's like you kind of... The thing is with RTS, it's so expensive to develop that like you can't really do a in your basement kind of RTS game. You need to have somewhat of a team, because just the way that pathfinding and just how RTS works technically, it's an expensive genre to develop. It's not like it's not like a platformer. Any indie can make a platformer, and some of the best platformers are indie. Like like Binding of Isaac, for example. FTL, there's a genre for it. What's it called?
As a roguelike.
Yes. Thank my man. Yeah. My man 5 Aces. Thank you. Like there are certain genres that indies can do well, but RTS is not one of those genres, unfortunately.
If I could take that and run with it, though, even though the game in question that I'll talk about isn't necessarily an RTS, it's a turn-based strategy. I don't believe that Kickstarter necessarily works because, well, like you said already, if it's Kickstarted, then the money is going straight to the developers, and the developers aren't really used to working with money. They're used to working with deadlines. On the other hand, what I have seen more and more being successful is early access. And having an early access RTS is a risky business.
Risky.
Very risky business. But one in particular I've been watching very closely is Endless Space 2. Whose publisher was Sega, and they were at the PC Gamer Weekender. And what they've done very cleverly, and I sincerely hope it works, is that they've created a single-player game first. And they've said, this is exactly what we have. You play it. You tell us how it works, and they are updating constantly based on feedback. So the community has that influence over the entire process. You're saying, is this balanced? Do they work? Are you getting absolutely trounced by AI? And then once they're at that stage, they've said, and they've got all the menu is ready to go, that we will launch multiplayer and keep working when the multiplayer opens. And people are queuing up to get tournaments going for when it's multiplayer because of how well it plays, of how well polished it is already. And as an early access, it looks like a final released game. And if you didn't have those blanked out things in the menu, you wouldn't know that they were going to be features.
That's cool.
It plays so well already. But the idea is that they built an RTS from the single player up.
Yeah, I winced a little bit there. I think Spotty did as well when you said early access RTS, because and that's exactly what we slammed 8-bit Armies for. Is that it delivered this very limited, lacking thing. But the idea of kind of segregating the single player and the multiplayer, whether it's you release multiplayer first, whether it's you released single player first, like that, I can get behind that, because then they're separate experiences, and you can have one that's really a good self-contained experience. Yeah. But if you try and do everything, like you have a shitty campaign, you lack features, you only have one faction, like that's just bad. That's not going to work.
Yeah, it's asking for trouble, especially with an RTS that has so many complex sides to it. Early access usually means that the quality is not going to be as high as it is at release. Yeah. So trying to have everything going at release, early access release, is not going to work ever. Which is exactly why 8-bit Armies has fallen apart, because it wasn't a good concept from the start, and trying to release everything together, it just looks poorly executed. But I'm intrigued with this one, even though it's not an RTS, and it doesn't necessarily have to worry about things like physics and all the micro involved, because it's a turn-based. They've got less work, but it's the idea of having the community in the balance from the very start that I think is so smart. It's so clever.
Yeah. So I think that kind of ties together with the whole idea of using Kickstarter as well. Like to go back to 5Ace's original thought was like, would Kickstarter work in a situation like this, or in a genre like this? I think the answer is ultimately yes. You know, all of the worries about Kickstarter aside, and even early access, the theory behind Kickstarter is good, because again, you know, as you had mentioned with some other games, you know, publishers force these developers to release the games early. So by removing the developer, or rather by removing the publisher from the equation, essentially, or rather removing the investor from the equation, essentially you're making the community, the players, become the direct investors in the game. And it's really the onus of the developer to have their crap together. You know, you got to have people in place that know how to get a product put out. Like, yes, you get, sure, it's great to have, you know, constant development and constant updates and things like that, but you look at games like Star Citizen. That game has been in development for, it feels like eons.
Yeah, and I like that. Like, I love how they're not rushing it out. Like, they're actually taking the time to do it right.
So it's great that they're doing that. I love the fact that they're so involved with the community, and that they're building, and they're so transparent about everything, at least from what I've seen of it. But the problem is it's just in this perpetual state of never going to be released. And, you know, to a certain extent, I think you do need to just accept it and say, okay, this is going to be released as an early access, with the understanding that it's like, okay, this is going to be released. It's not just something we're going to leave in this early access state and use that as kind of a scapegoat, as saying, oh, well, it's not really finished, so you can't expect a polished game. And, you know, that's one of the, because I'm a big survival game fan, and that was like the complete death of that genre as well. Like, all of these games were released as early alpha, and it was an excuse to release a garbage game in a terrible state with a great idea, but never finish it, and just be okay with that. They get your money and they walk away.
Yeah, especially games like you look at 7 Days to Die, that was so popular that it was ported to consoles in an unfinished state. Like, wow. Where is that acceptable? Who decided that that was a thing to do? And because of that, the PC version has since blossomed. It's gotten better. It's still a pretty broken game, but it's gotten better. The console version is still in the exact same state when it was first ported.
Isn't C&C 3 Kane's Wrath like 1.1 on console on Xbox?
Yeah.
Yeah, yep. So you still have like
what the patch is, but yeah, it's on console. Like I said, I came from that.
Yeah, so like I don't know if it's 1.1 or 1.0, but it's like Mechapeds and Marvs and like all those OP things. Good times. But we were definitely in Total Biscuit territory here. The things that he talks about a lot. The way that he puts it, and I certainly agree with that, is the moment you start charging microtransactions, your game is no longer early access. You have released your game, right? Like if you are charging people to like microtransactions in the game, you can't hide behind any scapegoat of early access. And Generals 2 did this. Generals 2, they were selling the commanders, the generals, and oh my god, the Okay,
What
so
the hell?
I often shit all over Company of Heroes for their commander design. So I don't know if you guys know how the way the commanders work. It's sort of like a sub faction within that faction, but it's not quite as much as say like Black Hand or whatever. But it's like you choose it in game, one of 3 options. But outside of the game, you have like 3 of say 10 options for loading those commanders in. And like, but the way that Generals 2 was doing it, I didn't finish my comparison. Yes, but so in Company of Heroes 2, a lot of the problem with the commanders is that they take away a lot of the core tools and mechanics of that faction and lock it behind a mutually inexclusive paywall. So say like you have British, they don't have the flamethrowers, but flamethrowers are an integral part of Company of Heroes 2 as a way to clear garrisons. So if you want a flamethrower to clear garrisons, you have to have this commander. It's like just mind-boggling stuff. And it's like with US, if you want to build mines, well, you have to lock in this commander. Like just and Generals 2 did that, but even worse. So with China, or APA, the Asian Pacific Alliance, I shit you not, you had the APA Rocket General, and you could only build rocket troops if you had the Rocket General. So like, yeah, so, like rocket troops. So like, if your opponent,
was the other infantry-based AT then?
There wasn't. There was no infantry-based AT. Like, if your opponent had tanks,
Love to see the balance.
You countered with your own tanks. Like, basically, the infantry was like there was rifle infantry. I think there was like a flame infantry, but he was locked behind the flame general as well, or something like that. It was yeah, so bad. Like rocket troops, like a core part of the counter system, let alone a part of just the overall mechanic of the game. And like, yeah, dude, Generals 2, it was pathetic, and they were charging people for that. Like, I put my money down. And to be fair, they gave refunds when it cancelled. But I put money down on it because I was like, I'm gonna cast this game. Like, I need. Yeah, but like, Jesus, yeah.
Well, it's a genius idea. If I were a developer and I were starved for cash, I would do this. But it's a really, really shitty way of doing it.
Yeah.
Wow.
There are ways to monetize RTS. I guess we can talk about that before we wrap up. We've been going for a while, an hour and 40 minutes. If you guys have to bail, then let me know. But something that I'd like to talk about now, we sort of mentioned this before, is how do we do free-to-play or even just microtransactions in general in an RTS game? I have some ideas, but do you guys have anything to say on that?
I would try. I like to say that definitely not the way that stuff like Company of Heroes does it, because it locks away certain options for you.
Yeah.
And some of those options are just, what is it, shock rifle frontliner or something that's just meta, and it's not something that's not unlocked right from the get-go. So you basically have to pay extra to be competitive.
Yeah.
That's a very bad way of doing it.
There's another example as well. I can't think of any strategy games that have done it, but you guys might know of some where the DLC in particular is either game types or levels rather than actual armies, so that you're immediately splitting your entire player base into categories of those
like
who have
Call of
base
Duty,
game.
like they did the map packs for that game series. Yeah.
So you are split open. I think they had it on Space Marine as well, where one of the game modes on Space Marine when that was released was specifically DLC. So you're almost halving, maybe even quartering your player base into those who don't want to fork out money and those that do. Those that do are probably going to have more fun. It's all roses and sunshine and so on. And those that don't get the full experience.
I think like one of the only ways of doing it is via cosmetic items. I think Company of Heroes is doing it as well, right?
Oh yeah,
as,
of
like,
course.
Skins.
Yeah, skins. Yeah.
But that's like, from my point of view, that's the only viable way I can come up with. And like, if people want to customize their tanks, if they want to run around with tanks with pink male genitalia drawn on them, let them have it. Let them have it. Let them pay for it.
It was so funny because of like your accent, the way that you said genitalia. Just, yeah. So,
free to play is a tough space to get into, I think, with RTS. I don't know that there's a good set of microtransactions that you could really set up in a genre like this, because like microtransactions, like in games where it's been successful, like again, the MOBAs, League of Legends, things like that, you get skins. Skins if I'm playing an RTS, I could literally not care less about changing the skins on the units. Like, yeah, sure, it's kind of a cool, quirky thing, but it's not gonna convince me to keep playing the game. But I think the important thing is that you need to continually update the game, and how they go about injecting cash flow into their business in order to allow them to continue to develop the game. It's a tough question to answer. I don't think anybody's been able to answer that. It seems like DLC is probably the best way to do it, as far whether that's single player or a combination of single player and multiplayer. I think there's probably ways to do it. Like, just taking for instance Command and Conquer 3, just because RTS as a whole is so wide open that Command and Conquer and Company of Heroes, while in the same genre, are incredibly different games. They couldn't, I mean, they're not even close to the same. So, just speaking specifically about Command and Conquer 3, using that as kind of like a test bed, you have Command and Conquer 3 Tiberium Wars, which was the base game that came out. It had three factions. It had the three main factions, right? Skrin, Nod, and GDI. And then that was a great foundation for where the game was. And then what they could have been doing in terms of DLC is, releasing new factions and new maps. New maps are so important, I think, in terms of competitive play, because that's one of the things that breeds the staleness of the game, is that you get tired of looking at the same visuals all the time. And that's exacerbated by the fact that you're using the same factions over and over again. So it's like, I think if you were to take and make the gradual move from Tiberium Wars into Kane's Wrath, where you go from having the three base factions to all of a sudden now you have the three base factions plus two sub factions for each of the base factions, turning out to be 9 factions in total. It just adds such a layer to the game that you wouldn't get in the base game, and it could be added over time as opposed to being released as a full standalone game.
Yeah, I think the important thing to really specify why you don't care about skins in an RTS game is because the scale of it. In a MOBA, right, like, you have one avatar, like you are this person, and this person occupies X amount of your screen, and this avatar, it represents you as a player. So it's a lot more appealing to have a skin for that one avatar. And kind of the same with Counter-Strike, I suppose, because the way the guns are, it's like on your screen, you're always seeing it. With RTS games, the units are small, and ideally, if you're playing well, you aren't even looking at them because you're just managing so many different things. It's so cosmetics, like it's easy to just say, like, oh well, other games microtransaction cosmetics, therefore RTS should, but that's a little bit I think not quite viable in RTS for that reason. And Company of Heroes 2 does have skins, and some of the skins look gorgeous, but like it's just not as appealing in general. I think the massive thing, I should probably address maps before I move on. I think maps are in this interesting, difficult middle ground where it's like maps are important for the longevity of the game, but as Will said, you don't want to split the community. So it's like, it's kind of a hard thing to balance. What Ashes is doing is with the DLC maps, anyone can join a lobby of that DLC map, but only the person who bought the DLC can create that map, the lobby. So like, if I buy said DLC, and Will does, he can play with me, but he can't host the game. Only if I make it. So it's like a way of doing it where you are adding in maps, but you aren't you're not splitting the player base necessarily. So I think that's certainly one solution to the map conundrum. But as for like other ways to monetize, I mean, single player is obviously a great one if it's done properly. I didn't really give the Theater of War a chance in Company of Heroes 2, but those were like kind of mini scenarios.
It's funny you mentioned that. I was about to mention it myself, because you were at Relic when they had the conversation about the percentage of players on Company of Heroes that are casual. That is their source of income when you think about it. The multiplayer percentage is so small that they're not necessarily going to care about skins. They will obviously have all the DLC commanders, not that we're saying that's a good thing, but it's in the interest of them winning for them to have those. So if you end up creating a single player campaign like they did with the Ardennes Assault, And Theatre of War, even though it wasn't great at all, it was a way of saying, right, the single player has only had a single campaign for the Soviets, and that was years ago. Let's give them more. That's where their income can come from. Without splitting the community. If you don't have that single player campaign, it doesn't mean that you can't play. It doesn't mean you can't play competitively the same way as everyone else.
Yeah, and there's already the existing campaign. The thing is with that, though, is like, when they say single player, that would also include skirmish versus AI, and like you do play the new factions, the new commanders, skirmish versus AI. So it's not like the multiplayer content is only for these hardcore competitive players. It is for the comp stompers as well, especially people that like play it co-op versus AI. I mean, I think any RTS game is heavily skewed towards single player. Like even StarCraft, you would find the majority of people bought it only for the campaign. But yeah, the thing that's missing that a lot of games are starting to do now, I think the first one to really do it was Smite, which is a MOBA. It's like you play it from third person, and now StarCraft is doing it as well. It's having audio. Is like, when you say cosmetics, people just think skins, but audio is a huge thing. So with Smite, you have an announcer that like says things like about what's happening, and you would have like a voice command that like you say, attack here, defend here, help me, and like you could change that voice to your character, because before it was just like this generic voicer who was really cool, by the way, really funny, but like you could then customize that to like different voice packs. And like the ward skins is a good example, but StarCraft 2 does this too. Now you have they announce the pack. You have like various characters from the single player campaign. That voice actor is doing the announcer. You know, where it's like additional supply depots required. You can then get like the Zerg person saying that, or like they had Total Biscuit, who is like a shoutcaster and a YouTuber. So, and they're actually monetizing those, and it's like, it's cosmetics, and it's fun, and it's cool. It doesn't affect gameplay, so it's like a fair way to do microtransactions in RTS without any downsides. And then that also has like skins, and I think even like avatars and stuff. I don't know if they're selling those yet, but like they have skins. So yeah, I think a push towards audio. Like I know in Company of Heroes too, like the OKW announcer, I fucking hate him. He is so goofy. Like the things that he says, like when units die, like I'm not gonna impersonate him, but like the OKW announcer is just bad. He's goofy, he's awful. Whereas some of the other announcers are really good, especially in Co1. Like those announcers were great. And
even just the generic lines of dialogue between units, not necessarily when you were clicking on them, but if you zoomed in on them while there was a bit of a lull, the conversations that they had were just brilliant. And they didn't need to be there. It didn't have to be a part of the game. It just added that character.
Yeah, like something that I've mentioned before, I think on the podcast here, is I would give Relic my money if they released the Australian forces, which basically like it reskinned, but more importantly, it revoiced all of the British and turned them into Australians. Because like I'm pretty sure Australians had all the same equipment as British, and even if it was just the infantry, like maybe not the tanks and stuff, but like if it was just a couple of core units, if it was just this squad, you could get that revoiced as an Australian or as a New Zealand, because we did serve in World War II alongside the Commonwealth, or like say the Osttruppen, who are like a prisoner of war thing. I don't know what the accent is. It's like some kind of Eastern European accent, like maybe Hungarian or whatever.
Generic Eastern Bloc.
Yeah. Like if you could get that voiced as like a Czech Republic person, like you maybe would have some people that would like that, or like having native languages. Like they have the native languages, but only if you install that Steam pack. Whereas like you can't have it English speaking English, German speaking German, Russian speaking Russian. You can't do that, and like that's another avenue. So I think to answer the question, how do you microtransactionize RTS? I think audio is the hidden kind of key that people aren't really exploring.
I think basically just anything that doesn't affect the gameplay, because then we're going down a slippery slope.
Yeah.
Where if you want to stay competitive, you have to pay money. But anything that doesn't affect the gameplay is fine in my book.
Yeah, or like single player stuff because it doesn't affect anyone.
Yeah.
Like Dawn of War 3 is coming out soon. And the way that the elites work, like you have like 3 elites that are like your heroes or like your super unit or whatever, and like I don't know this for certain, but I'm pretty sure they're gonna start selling elites as DLC, like Company of Heroes 2, and that's just gonna be so bad, for for all the reasons that Company of Heroes 2 commanders were bad. Maybe it won't happen, but it wouldn't surprise me.
That game is already one where I've tried to love it because I love Company of Heroes. I loved Dawn of War originally. Dawn of War 2 I could give or take, but I'm sitting back thinking this is a train wreck waiting to happen, and I'm just gonna have to step a little bit further back from it before it collides. I'm not looking forward to finding out how they're gonna make microtransactions install.
Yeah, I criticized it very heavily on the podcast, and I got shat all over for it. Everyone was like, "Well, Helping Hans liked it." It's like, yeah, but like these are the criticisms, like they're having all these tacked on MOBA mechanics. It's I'm sure not as bad as people making that to be, but like just the idea of them going away from what works in their franchise, so the only game mode at launch that they're releasing is not just an empty kind of annihilation map like you would see in the original Dawn of War, in StarCraft or C&C. It's like you have these lanes with these towers, and you have to like push down these towers and destroy your opponent's generator or whatever it's called. It's like this typical kind of League of Legends like map. Like it doesn't have the MOBA gameplay. In some ways it does, but in most it's not. It's still RTS by all means. It has base building and everything, but they're going away from the traditional RTS, the traditional Dawn of War 1 kind of concept. The art style especially, it's this cartoony art style. I'm not looking forward to that game. I mean, I am looking forward to it, but like I'm sure it's going to be disappointing and crappy. And I've heard a lot of people say that it is from people who've played it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to segue too much because I know we've got time, not necessarily on our side, but hopefully all of you guys would agree that what makes your favorite RTSs your favorites is what they brought to the table that was probably unique or different at the time. When you look at Dawn of War and Company of Heroes, the amount of things that they brought that was new to the RTS genre are what make me love them. And if you look at the amount of things that were in Dawn of War 2 in comparison to what are now in Dawn of War 3, there are more things removed than there are added. And you think of some of the games, some of the Command & Conquers going back years now, of what they did that other RTS games didn't even dare to do. Things that were just so unique that give them that character and that personality. And the last thing you want to see in a sequel is them taking those key features that made it that game away from it. Because Dawn of War 3 and Dawn of War 2 have so little.
Oh, yeah. Here we go. Is it time to talk about
C&C 4?
C&C 4?
Knows that in a very specific way. I mean, C&C 4 is the epitome of what you just described. It's like I appreciate the fact that they were trying to innovate and trying to do something different, but they just, again, they strayed so far from the original concept, the things that made the game great, and kind of lost sight of what it was that the game was. And as a result, they lost the entire player base. I mean, that game was dead on arrival.
But do we even consider it canon? Because it's universal.
Yeah, it's like Star Wars, isn't it? Yeah.
I don't even consider the actual storyline, because I never actually played through the entire campaign. Because I just couldn't stomach it, but the gameplay in and of itself, ignoring the storyline and how bad that may have strayed from the norm, is just objectively a bad game, and it's too bad.
See,
it speaks exactly to what you were saying about Dawn of War. It's like we've seen this before.
I'm gonna be devil's advocate here because I made this exact comparison in the DAO 3 podcast. I said like this is what happened if you stray too much, but apparently C&C 4 wasn't supposed to be C&C 4. Apparently it was supposed to be C&C Arena, and it was like I think mainly going to be aimed at like the Eastern audience, and it was like this multiplayer only thing, this kind of wacky spin-off arcadey thing. And then EA were like, you know what, actually we could make a lot more money if we turned this C&C Arena into C&C 4. So then they shoehorned in this crappy half-assed single-player campaign, and they released it as C&C 4, and then it brought with this expectation, and if it wasn't if it was named C&C Arena, people wouldn't have minded so much because wouldn't have had the campaign which wrapped up 15 years of Command and Conquer, and like the ending. Like, do you know the ending of the Nod campaign?
Yes.
Or could you care?
I've watched it on YouTube.
It's not canon, so it doesn't actually matter, right? It's not canon. Basically, it's like Kane ends up being Skrin, and the reveal is just like he steps out of some Skrin ship and then he flies away or something, and it's just like, just kidding. I've been Skrin this entire time. And we're like, okay, wow.
Oh, is that how the story went? Because I was always under the impression that he was trying to essentially become part of this race, and
Really?
It's interesting because C&C 3 is what kind of tied all of this together, with Skrin kind of being brought into the mix. Is that the idea was that he actually was the one that was the kind of the catalyst for bringing them there. I mean, I don't want to get into the story of C&C 3 or Command and Conquer in general, because we could talk about that for hours, but my interpretation of it was always that, and again, I could be wrong, was that Kane was trying to bring the Skrin there so that way he could kind of ascend into this new plane of existence beyond us mere mortals.
I thought they revealed him as being Skrin in C&C 4. Is that right? 5 Aces?
No, honestly, no.
Really?
Not really. Like from what I remember, he was kind of ascending. He was trying. He was kind of
right.
Yeah, he was kind of the conduit all along, but he himself wasn't Skrin, as far as I can remember.
Right.
Might be wrong.
Well, I played. I finished that campaign. I actually didn't finish the C&C 3 campaign. I did the Kane's Wrath campaign, not C&C 3. So I kind of missed that. Yeah, I must have misinterpreted it wrong. I know he steps in this Skrin ship and he flies away. Is that what happens at the end? He goes into a Skrin ship. Yeah. I thought that meant that he was Skrin like the whole time, because like people were speculating that because he keeps coming back after dying in every game. Yeah, but whatever. Anyway, so like as I said in the last podcast, is because it's Dawn of War 3. It has a lot of expectations with it, and I'm sure it's going to be very similar to Dawn of War 1 for the most part. I played the single player of it, and it seemed alright. The single player doesn't have that bullshit, but the multiplayer game mode with the lanes, with the pushing towers to win rather than like the way the resources in a free annihilation mode worked, it's just the expectations need to be there. So yeah, I think we can wrap up with that. Unless you guys have anything else to conclude on, things that we've breezed over. Oh, we didn't mention Halo Wars 2, man. Oof.
I'm glad that we didn't.
Let's talk about that briefly, because I think people will ask. Yeah, what do you think of it?
Me? I haven't actually played it. It's just I saw some screenshots of the game being ported into PC, and I think I actually watched your video on it, Machine. And that just confirmed what I knew all along, was that this was just going to be a ripped from console PC port. And seeing that wheel, it was like, yep, that was directly from Xbox. Yeah. They made no changes. Yeah, it has no interest for me.
Yeah, and it was more than just a bad port, just like the way the gameplay worked, where every single unit fight on the move with 0 penalties. Yeah. And the way that in the campaign, like, you kept losing your army to these nukes. Like there were so many design flaws on top of technical flaws on top of port flaws. Like it wasn't a good RTS game.
They had it completely backwards because like inherently a console is a bad place for an RTS, and like I think that's something that's objectively that's objectively true. And then they take an RTS game that's come out exclusively for console and port it to the PC. Like, I don't know. There was only limited potential for this game, I believe.
Yeah, like I'm glad it launched to console, and I'm sure people enjoyed it there because it's something new for them, and it could be introducing a lot of people to RTS for the first time. They go like, man, this is a really cool idea. Is there any games that do this better on PC? And that could lead to people playing 0 Hour or whatever other RTS. But there was a lot of potential if they did a proper port. Like I said in my review, that most the things on the outside were fine. Like the units looked great. It had a high budget, so like the presentation was beautiful, and the counter system worked and made sense. It was just the interface, some of the specific systems such as the fire on the move thing. Like it wouldn't have been that hard to make it a good game if they just kind of gave it a traditional RTS interface with like a 0-hour style kind of builder system, make the economy work better where you actually have to fight over resources, where in the game it's like you just build a supply thing in your base and it just gets income for free. Like you pay up front, but there's no like collection, there's no mining or harvesters. You just get resources, so there's no like harassment or anything. But it wouldn't have been that hard to make it a good RTS. Like of all the RTS games, it had the most potential because the marketability of Microsoft and Halo, the player base on Xbox, the polish, because again it had a big budget, but yeah, they just didn't give it a proper chance. Where I feel like with Grey Goo, like it didn't really ever have a chance, just because just the way that it turned out. Like it was never going to be a good game. Where Halo was too, I feel like there was opportunity where it actually could have been a good game, if there was more devotion to PC, which they obviously lacked. So
especially with an IP like that, you're thinking that you've got millions of supporters already. You've got the fan base built up, ready to go. And I couldn't help but feel when I played it in London, that some of the sound was great, the animation was brilliant, the warthogs just looked like the warthogs played. But it was Baby's first RTS, and it made me question straight away whether or not this was ever going to be geared towards RTS players. Because it's on console, I couldn't help but feel this is a way for traditional FPS Halo players to branch out and just try Baby's first RTS, and that was what it came across as. It worked as that very simple structure. Yeah, but it was never going to be anything special for us.
As I said in my review, it's like to write it off as, oh well, you're not meant to be taking it competitively. It's not StarCraft. It's supposed to be a casual game. It's like, yes, but you can't conflate like having a simplified, like you can't conflate having a game that is designed to appeal to casuals and is accessible and intuitive, and conflate that with games that are just bad. Like, and Halo Wars 2, there's so many design flaws and just parts about the game which you can criticize without it being like an excuse because it's a casual thing. Like, for example, the radial menus. Like, no one on PC wants radial menus. You go to, the most casual RTS gamer, he doesn't want radial menus. He wants, a StarCraft C&C interface, something intuitive, something easy.
Well, and to defend that design choice for a second, radial menus are amazing on console because you have the thumbsticks and it's extremely intuitive when you're working on console. But if you don't have a controller in your hand, working with a radial menu with a mouse just feels so wrong.
Yeah.
It just couldn't be farther from what should be done.
Yeah.
And again, I think that's a testament to the lack of effort that was put into the port, as you mentioned before. It's like it was very clear that they made no effort to bring this to PC in its own right. It was just slap it on PC, gobble up as much cash as you can based on the Halo name, and walk away.
And the microtransactions of like the Blitz card game. So many
yeah.
bad business practices. but yeah, I feel like that's the important takeaway, because a lot of people again shuttle over my reviews because they just, well, you can't say that because it's a casual game. Like, well, it's you can't excuse its flaws and its problems because it's under the banner of, well, it's for casuals. But anyway, with that, I think we can wrap up now. It's been a long podcast, actually, longest I think I've done for this, that is. So well done, guys. It's been a fun chat.
Good stuff.
And there's plenty more. Something that I would love to talk about, because something that's really, like, in another podcast, I mean, something that's very unexplored for me is like single player in RTS games. Like, I'm not really into single player. I'm not that interested in it, but like as now I'm working for Ashes of Singularity, it's like something I have to really think about now. It's something that I haven't thought about much. So I think there's a lot of discussion there about single player. But
I've been a single player only RTS gamer for like 10 years.
Wow.
I'll admit.
Yeah, same.
well, when I was younger, obviously, like when I was a kid. But like nowadays, I don't play single player RTS at all.
Or even backseat gaming, just watching my cousin getting his harvesters torn to shreds by the AI.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. So just a bit of plug. So Sparty does C&C 3, Kane's Wrath casts. 5 Aces does OpenRA. He doesn't have Twitter or anything, so if you just look up his name, I'm sure you'll find his YouTube videos. Same with Spartacus, Sparty TV. Monolithic Bacon makes Company of Heroes 2 maps, so not really a lot to plug there.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Buy his map packs.
Yeah. Well.
So
yeah.
like $5.99.
Gotta bring you over to Kane's Wrath, man. We need a new map maker.
Yeah, I'm always up to try anything new.
I heard there was drama there, right? Not to get into that, but wasn't there a big shitstorm?
Well, yeah, we won't go down that road.
Yeah, and if you
That's
need the
another
channel,
podcast.
I do a bunch of RTS content, Company of Heroes, 0 Hour, Dawn of War, bunch of different RTS things. So yeah, that's it. Thanks for watching. Hopefully you've stuck with us through this long time, and let us know what you want to see us talk about in future podcasts.
Yep. Thanks for inviting us, Machine.
No
Yeah,
problem.
thank you.
It's been fun.
Yes,
Thanks
thank
for
you very
having us
much,
here.
sir.